Good afternoon, everyone. I now have the honor to chair a session with my good friend, Fran Ulmer, who is going to speak on Arctic research within the framework of the upcoming United States chairmanship of the Arctic Council. It has been a very strong underlying theme of expectations during those 3 days that in a few months' time the United States will take over the chairmanship of the Arctic Council. And I think it is worth emphasizing that in the early years of the Arctic Council, when the US previously had the chairmanship, it was still a kind of a young, somewhat uncertain, definitely hesitant baby. But it has now grown into a formidable organization with active work on negotiations and connecting countries, not just in the Arctic regions, but also in Asia and Europe, into an extraordinary process of constructive work. And one of the missions of the Arctic Circle is to be helpful to the Arctic Council by providing a forum for dialogue and discussions, not only for the country that is responsible for the chair, but also other permanent and observer states. Therefore, we thought it would be proper, but also somewhat indicating how we will move forward within the Arctic Circle in the next 24 months or so, both next year and the following year, to have the final plenary session at the Assembly here now on a very important aspect of the US chairmanship. And we have already offered leading members of the State Department and other official US representatives here that at the Arctic Circle Assembly next year, we would be willing to organize sessions, both plenary and breakout sessions, that could be helpful in many ways to the US chairmanship, but also allowing each and every one of those who come to the Assembly to have an open dialogue and participate in exchange of views with those responsible for that leadership. I have often said to people in other parts of the world, and sometimes to our Arctic partners, that the Arctic Council is unusual. Apart from many other international organizations, in the way that the chairmanship is not just a formality. The country that becomes responsible for the chair is somehow, according to the practices and the cultures within the Arctic Council, expected to provide leadership, to provide a vision, to provide a direction of how we all together move forward. And it is in that spirit also that the chairmanship of the United States, following the Canadian chairmanship, is particularly significant. And I was extraordinarily pleased when I learned that Secretary of State John Kerry had appointed my good friend, Fran Ulmer, one of the most knowledgeable persons on the Arctic, as his special advisor on Arctic issues during the chairmanship period. Her career, not just in Alaska, but also within the US research community, and the ways he has been able to speak to United States policymakers and participate in the international discussions on the Arctic is outstanding. And I think it is testimony to where the Secretary of State, John Kerry, is heading with the US chairmanship. If I may allow myself a little bit of short political analysis here, which presidents are usually not supposed to do, according to the diplomatic rules, that he has chosen, on the one hand, Fran Ulmer, and on the other, Admiral Papp, as his two key advisors and representatives during those upcoming years. And we witnessed on the first day of the assembly an excellent and wise presentation by Admiral Papp, linking the duties and the responsibilities within the Arctic Council to the transformation and the leadership that President Kennedy was responsible for in the early stages of the space age. That was an extraordinary combination and a new way at looking at the Arctic, which I think augurs well for the upcoming years and the chairmanship of the United States. So with these words, I introduce Fran Ulmer, and after her speech, the floor will be open to questions, and in the interest of time, it's up to you when you want to start queuing up to put the questions, but we will reserve some time for a dialogue after her keynote speech. Fran.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, President Grimson, for that very kind introduction. I refer to myself as a student of the Arctic, not an expert, because I don't think, as much as anyone can ever know, you will know enough to be able to fully comprehend the complexities of this very special place that is both valuable and vulnerable to those who live there, but also to the world. My purpose here today is to do three things. Number one, reflect briefly upon the importance of the Arctic Council and the contribution it's made not only to the region, but to the world. Secondly, to talk about the importance of research to the U.S. Arctic Council chairmanship, which will begin next spring. And finally, to offer an invitation to all of you for suggestions and involvement in the upcoming U.S. chairmanship. But before I do that, I just want to personally thank both Alice Rogoff and President Grimson for their leadership and their vision in seeing the Arctic Council as the important thing to both begin and end this meeting with, because it is indeed a powerful institution, one that is becoming stronger every year. And I want to thank President Grimson for all his organizational work in bringing the Arctic Circle to fruition. I think many of you were here last year, as I was, and impressed by how successful a first year was and how that has grown this year. But it really is broader than just those of us who are here experiencing this. It is something that I believe is sending waves to the rest of the world, waves of information, waves of inspiration, and waves of invitation to learn more about this place and to become increasingly knowledgeable about it and involved in understanding it in a way that really benefits not only the region but the world. So thank you, President Grimson. Thank you to your very competent staff that has organized this effort. It is indeed impressive, and the fact that so many people are still here after 3 days of very serious, thoughtful, and impressive presentations is really quite remarkable. So, as you heard this morning before lunch from a group of Alaskans who spoke to this issue of the importance of the Arctic region to the United States, thanks to the fact that Alaska is a part of the United States, we have a lot of interest in and commitment to doing our most to really make this a successful effort. And as a 40-year-long Alaskan myself, I'm happy to help be a bridge to the people of not only our great state, but to other regions, and hope to be able to do that. I want to say that, as I mentioned, the Arctic Council is very special. And when the United States had the privilege of chairing the Arctic Council many years ago, I, at that time, was Lieutenant Governor and was the state's representative to the Arctic Council process. It was a much smaller, much simpler, much greener, in the sense that our principal focus was protecting the environment of the Arctic and some work on sustainable development. But as time has gone by, not only has it grown in its capacity to address a whole host of issues, but has it increasingly focused on the needs of the people of the Arctic and an understanding that sustainable development that evolves in a way that really benefits the people of the Arctic must be a core value. The involvement of permanent participants and the expanding list of people and organizations and non-Arctic nations that are now very important observers will continue to contribute to the value of the Council. As you all know, there have been recent agreements, particularly with regard to search and rescue and responding to oil spills, but there has been a wealth of information presented over the years thanks to the work of the 6 working groups. And they are based on a couple of key values: the importance of scientific research, the importance of collaborating across national borders, the importance of listening to people to understand more fully what the implications of this research might be in the region, and a sense that by producing these reports, not only the nations that are of the Arctic, but of the world, will benefit from the information that is provided to them. And you just heard a great description of a CAF report, a more recent publication that I think has profound implications as we think about our global responsibilities. Emergency prevention and preparedness and response, the work that was done there was unquestionably important, very, very valuable in producing the agreement that the Arctic Council moved forward. And similarly, the work done by PAIM and the protection of the marine environment, which positioned the countries to be able to take the next steps in adopting the agreement. Now, the U.S. will chair beginning next April. And I just want to emphasize that we see the 3 principal areas that have been identified: addressing climate change, Arctic Ocean stewardship, and improving the economic living conditions in the Arctic, as building upon prior work. The Norwegian chairmanship that emphasized climate change, the Canadian chairmanship, which has emphasized the importance of including and focusing on the needs of the people of the Arctic. The U.S. chairmanship is building on that history, a very rich contribution that has been made over the many years. One Arctic: Shared Opportunities, Challenges, and Responsibilities really envisions this notion that, yes, there are many Arctics, but there is one Arctic, that we all have a key and lasting commitment to making certain that it is as healthy tomorrow as it is today, and we all have a role to play in doing that. So, the portion of our agenda that addresses climate change does rely heavily on research and work that has already been done by the Arctic Council, but needs to be taken to another level. Unquestionably, adaptation and resilience is the thing that you hear most often if you go to the communities of the Arctic that are already facing some rather dramatic change as a result of climate warming, ice retreat, and thawing permafrost. So concentrating on the one hand, the things that we might do to reduce the rate of climate change, like short-lived climate pollutants, black carbon, et cetera, but also focusing on working with those communities that are at the front lines and are having to make dramatic changes as a result of what they are experiencing. Obviously, science has an important way of contributing to this work. Stewardship of the Arctic Ocean, again, this builds on much work that has been done by the Arctic Council over the years and its many working groups. And taking that to the next level, particularly looking at things like marine protected areas. There are many places in the world that have already identified marine protected areas. There has been discussion about and work on the notion that a marine protected area doesn't mean the same thing in every place. It can mean very different things depending upon what the needs are and what the built-up science and consensus of the region is. More discussion about that obviously will be necessary. Admiral Papp is particularly interested in the search and rescue exercises, as I think we all are, understanding the dramatic challenges associated with doing business in the Arctic, actually exercising our ability to respond, whether it's search and rescue or oil spill response, is a very important thing for us to put resources, time, and energy into if we are going to fulfill our responsibilities as stewards of this very special place. Improving the economic and living conditions of the people of the Arctic, again, building on the Canadian chairmanship, is very important to the United States, very important to the people who live in Alaska, and another way in which the work that has been done at the Arctic Council table, but also the way in which science and research can contribute to answering some of the really difficult challenges of this region, particularly things like renewable energy, which we've already heard a fair amount of discussion about this afternoon. Microgrids and the extent to which new technology that marries old technology with new technology in scale-appropriate ways is something that we believe we can make a considerable contribution to, not just in the Arctic region, but actually, as we heard from the gentleman from India, talking about the challenges of small-scale electricity development and distribution. I think there are lessons that can be learned in the Arctic that can be transferable to other places. A number of things that are listed are ideas that we have that we can build upon work that has been done and needs to be taken to another level. I want to specifically mention suicide prevention and resilience of communities, because I know that this is an area of tremendous concern throughout the Arctic region. It is something that in Alaska we have talked about, researched, puzzled about. I don't believe that there is one solution to this problem. What I do believe is that it would benefit from additional conversation among the providers, among the community leaders, among the experts in mental health and resilience, that we might be able to improve some of those aspects of life in the North that create a tremendous sadness in our lives. I want to speak a little more about the renewable energy concept. You know, we've heard today that there are a lot of traditional energy delivery systems that simply won't work at a place where you have very small communities that are separated by great distances. That doesn't mean that we should be satisfied with continuing to use diesel. Diesel that is not only very expensive, but that pollutes, and that is really yesterday's technology. So we'll be putting a heavy emphasis, thanks to some resources not only from the United States federal government, the University of Alaska Fairbanks that has done work in this area, but literally partnering with the many other countries, not only in the Arctic, but elsewhere, that see this as a problem where we can really make some progress. Things like community health and well-being, because of the availability of fresh water and adequate sanitation systems, this is not a problem throughout the Arctic, but there are many places in the Arctic where it is. And I'm sorry to say that in many Alaska villages, it remains an unsolved problem. This, too, could benefit not only from research and development, sharing of ideas about what is working in other places, but again, might provide the kind of technology that would actually be useful to other places in the world that similarly have small, highly distributed communities that really can't solve these problems in the old 20th century way. So we also believe that this is an area not only where research can benefit the people of the Arctic, but where those technologies can benefit the rest of the world. I mentioned adaptation and resilience a moment ago because, again, if you look at the examples that exist today, not tomorrow, but today in Alaska, communities like Kivalina and Shishmaref and Nutok, and over 24 other communities that have been identified by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers as needing to be moved because of thawing permafrost, because of coastal erosion, because of systems that are breaking down because of the rapid rate of climate change and its impact on these communities. Changing the way in which we do planning, engineering, and construction in communities that are experiencing this rapid rate of change requires us to do things very differently, including, I might add, educating the next generation of engineers. These are problems that really are very, very broad. They're not only how do we solve today's problems, but how do we build a system of thinking about how much we cannot rely on today as a guide for tomorrow. You know, engineers and planners, you know, they have to certify that what it is that they're building actually will work. And our common model for doing that is to assume, based on the experience of the past, that constructing things today can be done more or less as we've done them in the past. Well, we know that today doesn't look anything like yesterday in the Arctic, and we know that tomorrow isn't going to look anything like today. So this requires a rather large shift in thinking about decisions, investments, engineering, construction, doing business at all levels in a very different way. And I am hopeful that a combination of not only research, but also education and community dialogue can enable us to get to where we need to go. I know I'm just about out of time, so let me just say that some of the other ideas that have been put on the table as possibilities under the US chairmanship, again, look to some of the things that have been done in other regions so that we can ask the question whether some of these things might make sense as a new way of doing business in the Arctic. The regional seas idea might envision, for example, a new way of coordinating some of the research, some of the observation that we've heard a lot of people talking about how much we need to really synthesize the observing networks across the Arctic. Perhaps there are ways that organizations like a regional seas program that focuses on the coordination of Arctic observing systems might take us beyond where we are today. Finally, I just want to mention, as I briefly did this morning, that the Arctic Council has had a task force that has focused on scientific cooperation and is very close to language that could be adopted as either a voluntary or binding agreement. Discussions continue on that point. But I just might note that I think this represents taking the Arctic Council to another level that will really benefit all of the people of the Arctic, but all of the people in this room and beyond who don't call the Arctic home, but that are very, very interested in making sure that it is not only that the research is relevant and timely, but that it benefits decision makers, whether they're in the public or the private sector, to make better choices about the future. In closing, as the President mentioned, I chair the Arctic Research Commission. I want to refer you to commission work that has been done that may be helpful to you, and particularly refer you to our website, arctic.gov, which is where you will find materials that we have provided over the years to the research community since we were created back in the 1980s. And if you want to have a daily electronic newsletter that will tell you about everything that's going on in the Arctic, you can sign up for the daily update. So in closing, again, I want to thank not only President Grimson and Alice Rogoff for their leadership in the vision that gave birth to the Arctic Circle. I want to particularly thank President Grimson for being an Arctic ambassador to the world. He has taken on as his personal mission focusing the attention of people throughout the world on the Arctic, why it matters, what happens in the Arctic is important to people who live far away from the Arctic. I want to challenge each and every one of you today to become more like President Grimson. I want you all to leave here as Arctic ambassadors. I want you to think about sharing wherever you call home, when you get back home, some of what you have learned with your family, with your business and industry colleagues at your universities, that you might talk about the many challenges, the many opportunities, the many responsibilities that we all share in making certain that the future of the Arctic is a bright, safe, responsible, and sustainable one. So in closing, again, thank you all for not only participating, but for taking on the charge, the challenge of being an Arctic ambassador. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Fran, for your exciting and comprehensive presentation of what will be the emphasis and the mission of the United States during the chairmanship. And now we have some time for questions. And there is already one with the microphone, and others who want to ask a question. And like before, we will take turns left and right. So please start.
Sure. My name is Lara Satrakian. I'd like to thank you for your remarks and for your service. Your agenda for the Council, the U.S. agenda for the Council, is very much clearly focused on stewardship and environmental concerns. I personally very much appreciate that. We've heard so many impulses over the past 3 days of dialogue of how quickly development should be pursued and how vast the opportunities are, and whether there's a need to go slow, or and how it really works out and how it's pursued. Do you have a philosophy? Do you have a policy on how quickly development should be pursued, or is there a way to sort of be mature about that pursuit? Is there a coherence right now to what seems to be a lot of different perspectives?
Well, let me address that question by saying, first of all, I'm not the President of the United States or the Secretary of State. So I will qualify this by simply saying that I provide some advice from time to time, and I'm pleased and privileged to have the opportunity to do so. As a longtime resident of Alaska, and as someone who feels very strongly that there needs to be a balance between the way in which we consider our short-term interests and our long-term interests in the Arctic, I think that the answer to that question is not a simple one, and it is not one that can be answered the same on every issue that might arise. It's multidimensional in this sense. We will continue to see significant demands on the Arctic for the resources that are there, because they are there. And that's everything from oil and gas to fishing to the opportunity for tourists and for shipping. That is not going to stop. So my humble opinion is that we have to ask ourselves, what is it that we can do to reduce risk as much as possible to this very special place? It's not a question really of stopping it. It's a question of managing it. So risk reduction is something that I think we all need to explore and think about how different players in the system, government, industry, communities, individuals, NGOs, can bring their expertise and their abilities to reduce risk. Having served on the Deepwater Horizon Oil Spill Commission for the President, and having lived through the Exxon Valdez oil spill in Alaska, and having just come from a conference that was a retrospective on both of those, I am very well aware of the fact that there are a wide variety of ways that we can reduce risk through robust regulation, through an emphasis on safety culture within the industry, through a process of engaging local people, those who are most likely to experience the harm if there is an accident, engaging them in understanding what it is that will give them the sufficient reassurance that the decisions are being made wisely so that they become part of the process. All of those things, to me, are what we really need to focus on, maybe more than the question of to do it or not to do it.
My name is Bertel Helin, University of Copenhagen. This is an outstanding conference, and again, a warm thank to Iceland's president for this fantastic experience. My question is very, very short and very simple. I would ask, yes, Arctic is one, and there's one Arctic, but how do you see, as the new chair, how do you see the most conflicting issue in the years ahead?
Do you mean what do I think is the most conflicting issue? Well, actually, I'm going to take a slightly contrarian view and say that I am delighted that the Arctic is a region that actually, from the standpoint of the relationship among the countries, has been so conflict-free. I know that there have been articles written about the upcoming, struggle for power in the region. I think this region has, in many ways, illustrated for the rest of the world how it is possible for countries to work together on common vision, common goals, and actually provide a path to a future where people work together, countries work together, and individual interests. Yes, all of the Arctic 8 have national strategies, but if you look at those strategies, there is much more alike than they are different. They all talk about peace. They talk about international cooperation. They talk about the importance of sustaining an area that is ecologically very important and also very vulnerable. So again, I see this less as a place of conflict and more as a place where we can really be a good steward, that we can work with the people who live in the region and work together in a way that provides a brighter future. Now, having said that, I understand that there are lots of different values associated with the future of the Arctic that individuals may have, that companies may have, that regions may have. Much of that will be resolved at the national level by each nation, because we do respect the fact that each nation has its own agenda. But as I said before, so far anyway, those agendas, at least as articulated in their national strategies, are very compatible.
Hi, I have a simple question, but I believe it's pretty important, and it's actually for the audience here. I just want to see, with a show of hands, how many people think we could have an Arctic Circle Conference 2015 that is water bottle free?
Yay!
Thank you.
As a resident of Iceland, I really thank you for this comment, because I think it's very important to show good, to be in the front. But I have a suggestion that I would like to have you consider, Mrs. President. The thing is that I don't believe that it is enough to manage old-fashioned business into something that is going to be sustainable. I would like to see real change. 2 days ago, I asked really whether we are going to have business as usual in the Arctic. We have already commenced, we have already started this. Could it be possible, well, I say this before because this morning it was stated that we need to subsidize renewable energy systems. I believe that we are subsidizing the carbon economy. By not paying the full costs, we are leaving that to our future generations. Now, if we would really try and put carbon cost on all the carbon that is coming up north of the polar circle, into sort of taking that cost, if you pay a tax for the carbon that you're bringing out, and put all of that tax into renewable energy systems. Could that be possible as a policy to push towards those who are really going into the Arctic area to bring out the carbon that we really do not need in our atmosphere?
Well, the rules of the game in this assembly is the chair doesn't answer questions. So, I will make a few comments after the session is over. So, but you want to comment, Fran, or shall we take the next question? Well, let me just say two things. One is we will discuss with Harper whether we can have water fountains here in the hall next year, so you don't have to have bottles. Second, Iceland is an extraordinary example of where renewable energy is not only not subsidized, but is extraordinarily good business. So it's not true that all renewables in the northern regions have to be subsidized. We actually look at renewable as a very, very profitable business.
Okay. My name is Andrea Merlone. I'm chair of the Meteorology Group of European Commission for Environment. I would like to go back to science for a while. During those 3 days, we have seen that so many nations and research groups are making measurements all around the Arctic. And there are so many kind of different measurements running now. My point is, do you think that it is worth to consider a way to make all these measurements really comparable? I mean, during the last decades, there were been great improvement in the instruments, but not as well in the way they're used and in the way the people approach good measurements. They come from different nations, they have different procedures. Despite there are common rules, it is very difficult to assess if the map that we've seen from Google gives you exactly comparable values all around the globe. So I think that in the United States you have the NIST, which is the National Institute of Science and Technology, and the European Commission has the Euromet, and it's worth maybe to think on a way to dedicate appropriate way to include a robust, comparable measurement and a very accurate way, because the best the measurement is, and the shorter is the time that you capture a trend. And we know that in the Arctic, the trend is so speed that require really, really most accurate measurement than just buy an instrument and put it in the ground. So what's your opinion for the next 2 years to go towards a more robust standardization of the measurements with the help of the meteorology community?
Thank you for a question that is something that is very much on the table for discussion, not only as a result of the fact that it's clear need, and people have seen that for a long time, but because I think there's a growing awareness that technology exists today in a way that didn't before, that would enable us to go beyond where we are now in making information about Arctic observations synthesized, readily available, transparent, useful, timely, scale appropriate, all of those things. And that we aren't there yet. You know, there have been a number of efforts, SAON, AON, I could go on, where people have met on a regular basis, identifying this need to bring the observing together in some systematic way that would provide value added, to be able to actually understand what these various measurements, observation, data might be telling us. So I share your sense that this is an important thing to do, that it's something we are capable of doing. It is something that may be hard because it requires us to put aside some of our boundaries of organizations, of ownership, of methodologies, and it requires some money, frankly. It requires some sourcing of not only the ability to do this, organize it, but then a system that will provide continuity. It's not good enough for us to do this in the short period of time. It's something that we really will need to be able to compare information over time. So I don't know how many of you heard the Google presentation, but you know, I was tempted by this notion of a public-private partnership that maybe the governments alone and industry alone and can't do, that maybe we need to do it together. And I don't know what the organizing principle is going to be, but I do promise to be with you and everyone else in this room who thinks that this is important to try to figure out the best way to achieve it, because I think it's incredibly important. I think 10 years from now, people will look back at the way in which we are doing Arctic science in terms of how we provide information and say, that was 20th century. Even though we are already in the 21st century, I don't think we have figured out a 21st century solution to this problem.
Can I add a comment on the money?
No, I'm sorry, you cannot. We're running out of time. There are 3 other people
But
waiting.
I was trying to give a solution to the money problem.
No, okay, so you can talk to Fran about that later. We have already finished our time, but I will take these 3 questions very quickly from the 3 of those standing with the microphones, and then ask Fran to try to answer all of them in her final comments. So please be as brief as you possibly can and just put the question.
Thank you. We have learned a lot in these days. We heard a lot about technologies that will come, but there are existing technologies today that are not being used. For example, space sector can contribute a lot to monitoring what this shipping are doing. So one suggestion could be, while we are providing imagery to ships to help them to navigate, we could use the same imagery to control that they are not polluting the Arctic. You have been following the Deep Horizon, what happened in the Deep Horizon. This is very easy for space. Could you please elaborate in the future if you will be supporting using existing technologies today to do that? Thank you.
Okay, let's take, yes.
I have a question regarding priorities. I was a little worried. All your emphasis seemed to be on more research, more scientific data, rather than, there was nothing about leadership in improving the situation, improving wildlife, improving the natural resources and the biodiversity of the region.
And then the final question.
Yes, thank you very much for this session. I wanted to ask you if you think that in the next upcoming years there will be some discussion about gender equality in the Arctic Council. We have to look upon this subject, and we had this big conference in Akureyri this week about the subject, and we need more data about how the situation is, so we can follow up how we will proceed.
I will take all of those as good suggestions, and as I said in my opening remarks, part of why I am so happy to have the opportunity to be here today to talk about this is to really solicit suggestions, partnerships, opportunities to make the most out of the U.S. chairmanship. So things like looking at the gender equality issue, using existing technology, and thinking about how to use science as a way to really help decisions that can improve the Arctic are all very appropriate and need to be part of how we move forward in the Arctic. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Fran, for this. I think we can all agree that not only did your presentation and your speech indicate an offer in a very broad and open way from the upcoming chairmanship of the United States to have a dialogue with all of us, but also, and especially your responses and your answers to the questions put by the audience, is a very good example of what we hope to facilitate next year and the following year in the Assembly, in the form of a constructive dialogue between those participating in the Assembly, each and every one of those who come, whatever position they might hold, and those responsible for the chairmanship of the United States, in a very open, true, democratic, and friendly and constructive way. So thank you very much for having given all of us this kind of taste of what is the culture and the notion of the upcoming US chairmanship. As all of you might have noticed, there is no closing session in this assembly for 2 reasons. One is that although this plenary session is now coming to a close, there are a number of breakout sessions that start very soon, and they will go on into the afternoon or the early evening. I got a complaint from Fran last night as I was walking to a reception and she was coming away from the reception going to a breakout session. That so was the workload in this assembly that instead of enjoying herself in the reception with her friends, she had to go to a breakout session and have a discussion long into the evening. And that has perhaps been the character of these 3 days, that the workload has been heavy, the sessions have been many, and the requirements have been quite formidable. But as Fran said, the fact that so many of you have been here throughout this day and are still here this afternoon is a testimony to the commitment, the vision, and the profound interest of all of us in how we can come together to provide the successful solutions to the challenges in the Arctic. The other reason why there is no closing session is that the Arctic Circle is a process. That although each and every one of us go home at the end of this day, we continue to work together and prepare for the coming years and months. And as we announced at the opening session, we have already set the dates for the 3 next assemblies in 2015, 16, and 17. It has also been decided that there will be a meeting in Singapore at the invitation of the government of Singapore in the first week of November, back-to-back with a conference on the world oceans, where especially the Asian approach and the Asian perspective on the Arctic will be discussed. And since perhaps the roots of creating the Arctic Circle were planted in Alaska, in the friendship between Alice and me and Mead and many other Alaskan friends, including Fran, we hope, and if I may say so, Alice, we will be in Alaska sometime in the second half of next year for what we call an Arctic Circle Forum, which will be planned and executed in close cooperation with other partners in Alaska and in the United States. And although we have not decided on that yet, we have offered the notion to our friends in Washington and in the United States that if they find it helpful, we might also organize another Arctic Circle Forum in Washington sometime in the early months of the U.S. chairmanship, especially in order to discuss some of the issues which Fran has just touched upon and others who are particularly relevant for the U.S. chairmanship. And together with Kupik, we have discussed and decided also that we will have a meeting in Greenland, probably 100 plus in terms of attendance, given the facilities and the locations. Hopefully sometime in March or May next year. We already discussed that with the previous government of Greenland, and there's now elections taking place. And we will, when there is a new government, confirm that. But so far as the Arctic Circle is concerned, it is decided that we will go to Greenland and continue our dialogue there in a smaller scale, but in a very concentrated way. And this also, I think, reflects how the partnership between Alice, Kupik, and myself and many others came together some years ago with this idea and the notion that we would find a way to enhance the relevance of the Arctic issues to the global community and the decision makers and all the constituencies in the business world and the science world and concerned citizens in order to make success of this extraordinary large territory on planet Earth. Because if we don't make success of that, the rest of planet Earth will be in deep trouble. And I want to thank all of you who have this year and last year come together and made the effort to be here in Iceland, but above all, lent your voices and your insights and your knowledge and your experience to make the various sessions of the Arctic Circle Assembly so informative, so constructive, and so inspiring. I have been sitting here and listening to most of the sessions, and I have to tell you that even if I consider myself reasonably well informed about the Arctic issues, I have learned a lot. I have been inspired by many things that have come forward. And it has also given me a great number of ideas that I will bring to my friends and colleagues. And I hope it is the same with each and every one of you, that the Arctic Circle serves not just as a gathering where we meet friends and put forward our views and our research and our policies and our plans, but we also learn something new. We get fresh ideas. We meet new friends. We establish partnerships. As I said in the beginning, the core character of the Arctic Circle Assembly is that it is a village. And everybody, like myself, who has been brought up in a village, knows that in such a community, everyone plays a role. And without everyone playing a role, the village will not survive, succeed, and prosper. And I hope we will continue in that spirit in the coming years. This train will continue with various stops in the coming months in Iceland, in Alaska, in Greenland, in Singapore, again in Iceland and other places. And let's all be on board and continue to influence the journey. Because it's really up to each and every one of you what will be the agenda and whether the discussion on the cooperation will be successful. We are just facilitators in order to helping all of you to make the most of this. And therefore, as I said before, this is not the closing session. This is just a direction to encourage all of you to go to the breakout sessions and then continue working on discussing in these various ways. And as they say in this famous song, let us meet again in many different places and continue this effort in a successful way. Thank you very much.